In 2012, stars Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman gave the world a twisted finale to one of the most beloved television series of all time.
In 2022, we returned to Ireland to sample a well-aged expression of a fan-favorite brand.
The show is Sherlock. The episode is The Reichenbach Fall.
The whiskey is Tullamore D.E.W 14-year.
And we'll review them both. This is
the Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week, for the first time ever, we're not really reviewing a classic movie, are we, Brad?
We are not. I literally, in the moment, was like, well, I can't say the film is.
Right.
And it kind of threw me for a loop.
Yeah, you've thrown a wrench into everything, Brad. I think we should just give up now. We'll come back next week. We'll start with a movie again. I feel like we're tempting fate at this point.
Can we at least recommend that they go watch like the whole television show, or at least this episode?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, right. Go watch it. It's really good.
All right. See you next week, folks.
Yeah. Good episode, man. In and out.
That's what I like. Short and sweet right there. Now, Brad, we're looking at our first ever episode of television on this podcast. What we're doing with season 5 is Brad and I have each generated a list of movies that we want to revisit, or just kind of things that we haven't heard discussed before that we'd like to discuss for the first time. And one of Brad's movies, if I can put the word movies in quotes, is this episode of the BBC show Sherlock.
No, you're ordinary. You're ordinary. You're on the side of the angels.
Oh, I may be on the side of the angels, but don't think for 1 second that I am one of them.
Now, this is an hour-and-a-half long TV episode that, I watched it through again, Brad. I'm pretty sure the way the show is structured, they don't have, like, breaks for commercials either. So it really is kind of set up exactly like a movie. And one of the things I would love to talk about today is this kind of blurred line that we've created now, especially with the advent of streaming, of, like, what is a movie anymore? What counts as a movie?
Are you allowed to use the word blurred lines anymore? I thought that was like not PC.
It's like when you use the word Trump to talk about something being better than others.
Yeah,
right? you can't do that anymore. So
yeah,
exactly. You're right. But I want to have this discussion about like what is a movie anymore, because by all accounts, except for the venue that it was released, this is made like a movie.
Yeah, I think the reason I wanted to dive into the world of television was just to mess with you. That was primarily the goal, just to make Bob shake his head and go, really, Brad? But secondly, and much less importantly, out of all the television shows I've ever watched, including something like a Game of Thrones, this series is the only one, in my opinion, that really comes close to being a movie level quality production. I don't know. There's just not many things out there that capture your attention the way a movie does in television.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of it starts because of the stars of the movie, who are well-known movie stars.
Yeah.
So I don't know, man. I just thought it'd be fun to switch things up a little bit. And I didn't want to throw you too far off loop. I wasn't going to put like an episode of Big Bang Theory on here. So here we are. We watched Sherlock, and I'm really excited to talk about it.
I am too. So just for some context, if you've never seen the show Sherlock on BBC or, streaming in America, it's composed of 4 seasons, which are called series in British television. So 4 series. Each series has 3 episodes. I think the 4th season might have 4 because of that weird special they did. But each episode is an hour and a half long. So it's like essentially you get 3 movies to watch, and that's a season of Sherlock. And what we're reviewing today is the season 2 finale of Sherlock. So it's a really weird place for us to kind of dive in as our first TV episode. I imagine that a lot of our audience, Brad, will have seen this at some point. I mean, it's been out for, almost 10 years now. But, if you haven't, if you're new to the world of Sherlock, just be forewarned, we are going to talk about spoilers here. We recognize that it might be a little weird to hear someone talking about the finale of the second season of the show you haven't started watching yet.
Yeah, I will say this. This is probably the first time we are giving like a genuine spoiler alert in the history of the podcast. So I will say, if you have never watched Sherlock, stop listening to this episode right now. And over the next, 2 to 4 weeks, watch all of Sherlock.
Mm-hmm.
It is one of the most mind-bogglingly cool shows that's ever been made. The twists are fantastic. The journey it takes you on is spectacular. So genuine, full-on spoiler alert. If you haven't watched it, go watch it.
All right. With that spoiler alert intact, we might as well get Brad Explains out of the way here now. This is where Brad breaks down the plot of the... No, I don't mean it like that. I just
get it out of the way so we can get onto the good stuff.
We can't talk anymore about this episode because it is such a spoilery episode. So we might as well just give away what happens at this point. So I think we should move into Brad Explains, which is the part of the podcast where Brad breaks down the film that he has just seen, often for the first time. This is neither a film nor Brad's first time seeing it. So it's going to be a really unique Brad Explains here. But Brad, you get 60 seconds to describe the plot of this episode of Sherlock. Can you do it?
I might be able to. In this episode, we find our heroes Sherlock Holmes and John Watson becoming more and more famous. As Sherlock continues to solve high-profile crimes, the tabloids cover him, the newspapers cover him, and as he becomes more famous, it makes his compatriot a little nervous about people wanting to take him down or turn on him. And sure enough, his arch nemesis, Moriarty, basically turns him into the anti-hero. It has a very Batman Joker vibe to it, which I know Bob's going to talk about later. Mm-hmm. But all that being said, he engages in this battle of wits with Moriarty, where Moriarty turns the world against him, convincing so many people that he's a fraud. And by the end of it, there's a showdown in which he is forced to either kill himself or allow his friends to be killed. And it's wild. And I'm not even going to spoil the twist. We'll talk about the twist in a minute here.
All right. Listen, you did about as good of a job as you could do without just completely giving away everything that happens in this episode. So, Brad, there's a few main things I want to hit as we talk here. I don't really think we should jump into the philosophical what is a movie question right off the bat.
If you want to engage with that question some more, friend of show Patrick H. Willems just put a video out a few months ago called What Does Cinematic Really Mean? Mm-hmm. Go watch that video.
It's a good video.
It's really, really phenomenal.
I do want to touch on that before the episode's over today, but I think maybe the best place to start is to try to just kind of knock out our standard discussion points, Brad, to talk about the performances, to talk about the look, the direction, the editing of this episode, and then kind of open it up to some unique things that we get to talk about with this as a TV show that we wouldn't normally get to talk about. So let's just jump right in with our two leads, our co-leads, I guess, in Benedict Cumberbatch as Sherlock and Martin Freeman as Watson. Take it away, man. I want to hear, who do you want to talk about first?
Let's start at the top. We'll talk about Benedict.
He's fantastic.
He embodies Sherlock so well. Mm-hmm. And I will say, I feel like he could be played by lesser actors and still come across well because he's such a unique character. He has such a niche in acting of you just have to portray somebody who's always disgusted with everyone else because he's so much smarter than them. And I think a lot of people could take that and run with it, and it would be fine, but it wouldn't be as impressive as what Benedict does. And I think it's in the small moments of this show where it's when you see Sherlock doubt himself and doubt the understanding that he's come to or the conclusion that he's come to. It's those places where I think you really see Benedict Cumberbatch just shine as Sherlock.
I think a recurring theme that I'm going to keep mentioning as we go about this episode is the influence this has had on TV in America since it came out. But you kind of have to put this into historical context a little bit. right before this series started, you have, or I guess right before this episode aired, you get Guy Ritchie's take on Sherlock Holmes with the Robert Downey Jr. movies that he made. He made 2 films as Sherlock Holmes, and they're very much Guy Ritchie movies. Like it's like if you took Snatch and made it about a detective in the 1800s. And they're fine. They're really good. Robert Downey Jr. is his sarcastic self. This is a very different take on the character that Cumberbatch is bringing. And I think the thing that I really like about it is that they let him be a dick, but he's not a dick in like a sarcastic, condescending way. And when he is that way, it's portrayed almost as if his intelligence is not just a burden, but almost like almost like an illness, like a mental illness. There's like something within him because of his intellect that took up the part of his brain that should have empathy. Do you know what I mean? And I think the way he plays it is very much like, I know that I'm saying mean things. I'm trying to feel a twinge of conscience here. I just can't do it. And, you know, as the series goes on, characters come to exploit that. There's an episode in season 2 where there's kind of like this high-priced call girl who kind of wins Sherlock's affections by seducing him. And it's very obvious, like, they keep calling Sherlock a virgin through that whole thing. And you really start to get the sense of like, oh, they're making this guy into a much more complex character. And it's a little more realistic for, you know, what would a character with this level of intelligence look like in the real world? And I really appreciate that they add that layer to this character. And Cumberbatch plays it beautifully.
Yeah, he has this ability to connect with people despite his brutal intellect. And it gives life to all the people that rotate around him. And I think if there's anything that there's a lot of things that this show pulls off so beautifully. But one of the best parts about it is really how the writers keep this cast of characters revolving around Sherlock. Mm-hmm. But they do it in such a way that you understand why these people stay with him. Mm-hmm. You know, it's normally with somebody who is that brutally honest and mean and smart and snarky, like you feel like nobody would ever want to be their friend. And yet throughout this show, you get it. You understand why people want to be around him. And I think that's the reason why people are so drawn to the show, is because Cumberbatch gives such a spectacular performance that despite how just asininely mean he can be at times, you, the audience, also want to be around him because you want to experience greatness.
Yeah.
And that's what this show really knocks out of the park.
Part of the reason that I said, that, you know, I'm going to bring up the influence it had, there's a show on TV now that's a really popular show. I think it's on ABC called The Good Doctor. And it's about this kid essentially who is a doctor and he's autistic, I believe. I've never watched the show, but like I've read up on it. I've seen clips from it. And essentially what they did with that show is they kind of took the pattern that Sherlock set out, which is you kind of compensate for somebody being hyper intelligent and hyper competent by giving them some sort of fatal flaw, right? Like that's the way you give Sherlock Holmes a character arc. And what I love about the way this series does it is Sherlock will tell you that, you know, his character arc is, I'm trying to find someone who's my equal. I'm trying not to be bored. I'm trying to be challenged by these puzzles. But what his real character arc is that he's a guy that's trying to find a heart, and he's a guy that's trying to find family. And that's what makes this show so compelling, is watching him actually develop empathy for other people in a way that, like, it really reminded me, Brad, and this might seem weird on paper, but like, it reminded me a lot of the Zuckerberg character in The Social Network, and the way that everything about that movie is pointing back to, you know, at one point, Andrew Garfield's character looks at him and says, I was your only friend. You had one friend. And it really highlighted the whole like Facebook friend thing. But the lesson that you come away with at the end of that movie is, Mark, you're not an asshole. You're just trying so hard to be. And I think that it's such a great encapsulation of the Sherlock character here, too.
Yeah. And I think that especially, that's such a good comparison, dude. I didn't even think about The Social Network. Because when did that come out? Was that 2012
2010.
or 11? 2010. Okay, so that came out like at the exact same time as the first season of Sherlock.
Yep.
So yeah, you're right. There's such an emphasis on family and friendship and the loyalty that Watson has for Sherlock that it's just compelling. Man.
All right.
Well, let's move
into Watson.
Let's talk about Martin Freeman.
I'm so conflicted on Martin Freeman as an actor. He seems like a lovely man, and I like him in everything he does, but kind of without fail, I always find myself kind of questioning, like he makes a choice or two in every performance where I'm like, like that's what you chose to do there, huh? And his kind of trademark is that sort of stuttering, like hemming and hawing that he does. He does it all the time as Bilbo in The Hobbit. Like if you took out the amount of times he stutters and says hum and that movie would be 2 hours instead of 3 hours. It's just, that's the way he acts. And in this episode, like he has a couple moments, especially at the end when Sherlock is up on that tower where you see him trying to grapple with the reality of what's about to happen. And he keeps telling him, no, but it's the line readings that I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if you're really selling this. And when he actually is overcome with emotion, I'm like, I don't quite buy it with him. And I don't know if it's just because he kind of started out in a comedic kind of acting role with The Office in Britain before he transitioned into more serious roles. But I just can't ever quite get over the hump with him, if that makes sense.
Man, I was not expecting that. I feel like Martin Freeman is pretty universally beloved.
Oh, he's a good actor.
For me, I think the reason he works and the little bit of a stuttering, the little bit of hesitancy that he often has, it works for me because of how strongly he plays himself as a military man. Mm-hmm. That like even at the end of this episode when he's standing at Sherlock's grave and he kind of like wipes his nose a little bit in his eyes and he stands up straight and then he doesn't quite turn on his heel like he's at a military parade, but he turns and walks off straight back. There's something about how he plays himself that it makes those emotions work for me. Mm-hmm. To me, it sounds like somebody who was in the military, who doesn't know how to express emotion, who has been taught that there's a certain way of being emotional, trying to grapple with deep, dark, just terrifying things that are happening in his life. And for me, if you were trying to convince somebody who is a doctor, who is logical, who is, believes what his eyes and see and his ears hear, trying to convince him that, nope, your best friend of the last few years, he's a fraud. It's all fake. It's all a gimmick. The way he responds to it, to me, feels incredibly authentic to how a highly rational person would respond. Mm-hmm. So I really like his performance. And I think that the primary reason Sherlock works as a TV show is because of the chemistry between Cumberbatch and Freeman.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think if I can transition into another actor here, I think the reason this episode in particular works so well is because of the Moriarty character. This is one of the most famous villains in all of English literature, and he's brought to life by Andrew Scott, who, won a ton of awards for this performance and has gone on to win more awards for more shows that he's been in. He's really popular for the show Fleabag that came out a couple years ago. Brad, I have questions about Moriarty, and I don't know where I land on Scott's performance either.
Speaking of clever, have you told your little friends yet?
Tell them what?
Well, I broke into all those places and never took anything.
No.
But you understand.
Obviously.
Off you go then.
You want me to tell you what you already know?
No, I want you to prove that you know it.
You didn't take anything because you don't need to.
Good.
You'll never need to take anything ever again.
Very good, because?
Because nothing in the Bank of England, the Tower of London, or Pentonville Prison could possibly match the value of the key that could get you into all three.
I can open any door anywhere with a few tiny lines of computer code. No such thing as a private bank account now. Or mine, no such thing as secrecy. I own secrecy.
I think just with Sherlock in general, every actor, it seems like they're allowed to make capital C choices. Do you know what I mean? Like they're just kind of given free rein to like take their character and do off the wall things. And I think sometimes with some of the characters, you really start to notice it because, for the most part, Sherlock behaves a certain way. And so whenever Benedict Cumberbatch makes an acting decision that isn't kind of like cohesive with the rest of what he does in that performance, you notice it, right? Andrew Scott's performance, and I hate to use this word to describe it. I know it's kind of taboo to use this word now, but it's kind of like a schizophrenic, all over the place performance. Like, he goes from being very, very menacing to joking about how menacing he is. He goes from, there are times in this show where they play him as like a bored slacker, and then there are times where he's pretending to be a very, effeminate gay man. And I don't know what his sexuality is, and that's part of what makes him, a good foil to Sherlock. There's moments like in that rooftop confrontation where you're like, oh my God, like he's really in control. I'm scared. I don't know what's going to happen. And I think the Joker is a great comparison because of the way this show builds the dread to that showdown. But then there's also times where like he goes so big and so over the top and so hammy with it that I'm like, are you really the supervillain of this of this series? I don't know where I'm landing on him, Brad. Like, does every decision he makes work for you, or are you kind of on the same page as me here?
I think I'm close to the same page as you. I think I'm in the same chapter at the very least.
Okay.
I think that I'm going to compare it to another character in the series. This is based on memory. I haven't watched the show in a while, but do you remember it's either season 3 or season 4, the villain who has the mind palace?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You remember that?
Mm-hmm.
And it ends with Sherlock like concluding that the only feasible option is to kill him, and then he goes to jail.
Mm-hmm.
I think he is more of a classic Moriarty.
Yes.
Than what Scott does in seasons 1 and 2.
Yeah, agreed.
And for me, he is the most memorable villain for me. Now, obviously, I remember the name Moriarty because he's the famous piece of literature. But I think that the rooftop scene is what really ties the character of Moriarty all together. But even in that scene, he has moments where he goes really, really big.
Mm-hmm.
And I really wish that he had played that scene completely cold, completely calculating, because if he had done that, then I think it would have shown that all of the other stuff, all of the dark whimsy of his character, if I can put it that way, that was all a show to get at Sherlock. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And so I think that if in that scene he had played it completely cold, manipulative, and like uncaring, and like, nope, we're just playing chess and I beat you, I think that would have tied together all of the wildness of, the hamminess of him pretending to be Richard Brooks, the author or the actor, and all these other things. It would have tied it all together really well. But you're right in saying that even at the end, when he's so cheesy and just chewing all the scenery, it's at a certain point you're like, what am I supposed to be thinking about this character? Mm-hmm. And anytime you leave an audience unsure of like how they're supposed to take a character, especially your primary villain, I just don't think it's a great thing.
All right, before we go to break, I do want to talk about one more actor here, and that is the co-creator of this show, Mark Gatiss, who plays Mycroft. And if I'm being honest, Brad, I think that Mycroft Holmes might be both my favorite character and my favorite performance in this whole series, because my man Mark Gatiss just understood the assignment. He is the snooty, very intelligent, but always less intelligent than Sherlock brother. And the family dynamic that they play up is really funny every single time. But then what I love is that every once in a while they give Mycroft like his due. Like he does something that Sherlock wasn't anticipating, and you're reminded, oh yeah, Mycroft is a really smart guy too. And I just think that every time he's on screen, I just feel like I'm in good hands. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, dude. I was thinking about this earlier when you were talking about how Sherlock kind of traded off emotional capabilities for intellectual. Like one of my favorite sci-fi books of all time is called Ender's Game and Ender's Shadow. It's 2 books written by Orson Scott Card. A lot of people have probably heard of them. But one of the key themes in those books is this idea that geneticists have figured out how to flip genetic switches, but there's always a trade-off. And for the main character in that book, it's intelligence for the trade-off of they can't control his physicality and he's going to die early because he's going to grow and grow and grow until he dies. And in this one, I think you see a similar sense of like Sherlock had the intelligence, maybe not a switch, but like a slider. If I can use some Spinal Tap terminology, he had his intelligence turned up to 11, and Mycroft has his at like 9.25, right? But his emotional intelligence is at like a 7, and Sherlock's is at like a 2.
Right.
And so I just love how they play that off. And in the midst of that, these two incredibly intelligent men who grew up together, they still bicker like they're children sometimes. And it just hits the spot every time he is on camera.
All right, man, I think we're in a good spot to stop here. I want to get into some more unique things about this episode on the back end of the show, but what do you say we pause? Let's try this Tullamore D.E.W 14. What do you say?
Let's get to it.
All right, so today we are checking out Tullamore D.E.W 14 year. Brad, I am very excited to revisit the Tullamore D.E.W line. We have not had anything in this line since season 1. And I have spent like 4 seasons worried that I shouldn't call it Tullamore D.E.W because technically the name of the whiskey is Tullamore D.E.W, like it is D.E.W. And apparently what I found out is that this is just a marketing thing because it actually used to just be capital D and then lowercase E.W. It is called Tullamore D.E.W. I am not crazy. I am very, very happy to finally verify that.
Did they like just find some random like obscure figure in whiskey history that had the initials D.E.W?
You know what? I didn't even look to see. I'm sure it stands for something, you know, like dram of exquisite whiskey or something. You know what I mean? Like,
bro, you need to get into some marketing.
They have to have something that it stands for, but it's pronounced Tullamore D.E.W. So the one we're trying today is a 14 year, and it comes in this beautiful box. Brad, I actually found this in the state of Ohio. Every year, they basically decide what whiskeys, what products they don't want to sell anymore. And so they send them off to these locations that are called last call locations. You get them at a discount. So this is not sold in the state of Ohio anymore. It's sold everywhere else, though. This is, again, a single malt whiskey, triple distilled as most Irish whiskeys are. Aged for 14 years, and then it's finished in 4 different kinds of oak barrels: ex-bourbon, Oloroso sherry, port, and Madeira casks. And that is like all of the finishes that we like in whiskeys combined into one whiskey. I am freaking pumped to try this, dude.
Yeah, man. You have me sold anytime we do an Irish whiskey. There are very few that I've ever had that I disliked. Pretty much all of them score around a 35 or higher. I love it, man. I think that this is going to be a blast.
All right, let's dive right in. What are you picking up on the nose here, Brad?
The first note that I took was bright with an exclamation point. Mm-hmm. Like, I just love the tone of Irish whiskeys. Like, I don't know. Does that make sense? Like, they just have a certain note that they all seem to hit that I'm just in love with. There's vanilla, there's pear, there's honey. It just has a really nice, pleasant, gentle nose that has a little bit of complexity and a lot of stuff going for it. I'll give it an 8 out of 10.
Yeah, the first note I get is just like apple juice. Like, it's just a really bright apple. And then you got pear. I got more peach on this one, or almost like peach like skins on this one. Really, really nice. It is bright. It stays bright. Once you kind of let it breathe a little bit in the glass, I think a little bit of that maltiness comes out a bit. And then you get some baking spice too. Like, I get a lot of cinnamon on this one, which is surprising because I don't really pick that up usually on Irish whiskeys. I like this a lot. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm going to give it an 8.5 on the nose.
Yeah, and as we get into the taste here, I think that overwhelmingly I get a lot of honey. You're right on the malt. There is just some really nice malty undertones that give you all the flavors you want. And for me, the apple really came through on the taste. Once again, I think that this is a supremely impressive whiskey. I'm actually going to go up a little bit. I'll give it an 8.5 on the taste.
Wow, this is really interesting, isn't it? This is not what I was expecting on the flavor. It's very prickly, really spicy, and kind of dark. Like really, I don't want to call it bitter, but there is a layer of bitterness that kind of washes over you when you take a sip, and then it's followed right when you go to swallow by some kind of tropical fruit that I am really struggling to pinpoint. Like it's either like a mango or a papaya, but it almost tastes like when you eat, like tropical fruit candies. Like they kind of just try to approximate what they think a papaya would taste like. It's got like this kind of, you ever have like the Skittles that come in like the blue package or even like the berry flavored ones that are in the purple package? It has that kind of a thing going on, but it's at the very, very end. So it doesn't taste like fruit throughout the palate. It tastes like really bitter malt, and then you get fruit on the very end. It's really interesting, and I'm still trying to decide what I think of it. But for now, I think I'll give it an 8 on the taste. I think I'll give it an 8.5 on the finish.
For me, the finish is where it kind of dropped off a little bit. I just thought it was kind of short and sweet. There's a little bit of pepperiness going on that I liked, but overall, not quite as much as I loved the first two aspects of this. I'll give it a 7.5.
All right, so when we talk about balance, where do you think this one lands, Brad?
Well, I think you get this really beautiful mix where you have the sweet and fruity, kind of up front and on the palate. And then you get a little bit of that maltiness and pepperiness coming through by the end of the experience. I think it's a really well-balanced whiskey. It doesn't stand out for me in any way, like blast any other Irish whiskeys out of the water. I'll give it an 8 out of 10 on balance.
So here's where I'm kind of coming out on this one. It just seems so vastly different than most Irish whiskeys we've had. Like, in the sense that, do you remember when we did the Ahru whiskey? And like every one of those was like, wow, where has this been in the world of Irish whiskey? It's kind of like that, but I'm not as excited about it. And I kind of wonder if the 4 different types of finishing barrels might have been too many to introduce into a blend, because Oloroso sherry barrels draw certain things out in your whiskey, and ex-bourbon barrels will do the same thing. But then you've also got the port and the Madeira here. And those are 2 things that, and folding in the Oloroso, like, do all of those things mix well together? And I feel like this one doesn't have complexity to it as much as it just it seems kind of muddied in a way on the palate. And so I don't really know how well balanced I would call this one, Brad. I think if there is an area where this suffers for me, it's on the balance. I think I'm actually only going to give it about a 6 out of 10 on the balance.
Well, and that kind of leads us into our value conversation. Bob, in general, it seems like you're able to get this bottle online for around $70. And that for me it's hitting a level of price that I'm probably not willing to pay for this. I like this whiskey a lot. It has a lot going for it. But when you have something like the Sexton for $35, it's hard to double that and buy this. I don't think it's a terrible value, but I'll give it a 6 out of 10.
Yeah, it's hard to draw comparisons with this one because it's aged for so long, and we don't typically see 14-year aged Irish whiskey. So I would think that for the process that goes into it, this is at an appropriate price point. But when you can have other varieties of whiskey that are probably aged for similar lengths that are as expensive or cheaper than this, like, is this as good as any 14-year Scotch we've ever had? Probably not. Like, I don't think so. Is this as good as any 14-year bourbon we've ever had? I would say probably not. So at the end of the day, I respect the craft that went into this, but I'm probably not going to recommend it. I'm only going to give it a 5 out of 10 on value. And Brad, that's going to bring me out to a 36 out of 50. What are you coming out to?
Just above you. I'm at a 38 out of 50.
All right, so that's bringing us to a 37 out of 50 or a 74 out of 100. Brad, what's your recommendation on this?
Try it at the bar. Maybe don't buy a bottle.
All right, so let's just say you're trying it at the bar. This is probably going to cost you like, I don't know, between $14 and $20 a pour, I would think.
Yeah, probably.
I mean, is this worth, let's just call it 17. Is this worth a $17 pour?
Oh, man. I think for the experience of having a 14-year Irish whiskey, I would say yes.
Mm-hmm.
But even that, yeah. That's a lot, man.
Yeah, man. I'm kind of bummed. I have been holding on to this for almost 2 years now, like waiting to try this with you. And it didn't quite live up to expectations for me.
Yeah. I don't know. If the expectation was for it to be like a 9 out of 10 across the board, then yes. For me, it was a really pleasant Irish whiskey experience that's soured a little bit by the price.
Yeah. All right, man. So maybe not the best Irish whiskey we've ever had, but I'm still happy we tried it. What do you say we get back into talking about Sherlock?
Let's get to it. All right, everybody. That was Tullamore D.E.W 14, a whiskey that we both liked, but we're a little underwhelmed by. We are getting back to talking about Sherlock, and Bob, I'm really struggling right now because I know we're not getting into final scores yet, but I'm already asking the question, how are we going to score this? Because it's a TV show. It needs to fit into the ultimate, bearing of the series, and yet we're reviewing it here on a movie podcast. So I don't know, man. What are your thoughts?
So that's kind of what I want to get at here is like on paper, everything about this is it's made like a movie, but there are still things about it that it isn't a movie, and I don't know quite how to put my finger on it. But I think part of the problem for me, Brad, is that the episodic nature of these TV episodes is really what does it. And it weirdly gave me an appreciation for Marvel movies, because every time we review a Marvel movie on here, I comment on how they have just serialized this story and you have to go to the theater and see every chapter. And it pisses me off because a lot of these characters I don't care about. And I hate that I have to go watch their dumb movie to understand the movie that's coming out 2 movies from now. But I have to give credit where it's due. Marvel always does a really good job of, even if you're coming in like midstream to these movies, or even if this is like your first Spider-Man movie and you haven't seen the first 2 Spider-Men, they do a really good job of establishing characters again for you. Whereas this one, because it's a TV show, it really does just kind of assume you've been watching to this point. And I have to say, watching this divorced from all the episodes leading into it made for a really weird experience. Like, I don't quite know how to evaluate this because it didn't feel complete watching it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it 100% does. And I will say, I don't think that that's the fault of Sherlock in any way.
No, it wasn't designed to be reviewed like this. Yeah.
Yeah. So like, for me, I think Marvel has taken the movie format and serialized it as much as it can.
Mm-hmm.
And Sherlock took the TV format and cinematographied it as much as it could. I don't like, you know what I mean? Like, they basically took the format of television and made it as much like a movie as they possibly could without removing the fact that it is a serialized television show.
Right. And I think that like where that really came back to bite me on this experience is that, I watched this whole series when it was on Netflix years ago, and I just devoured this thing. And when it got to this episode, this is one of the biggest moments in television history for me. Like, there's a couple moments in Breaking Bad that are up there. There's a couple moments in The Sopranos that are up there. But this is one of those ones that, when Sherlock jumps off the roof and dies at the end of this, you're like, what? Actually, for me, the moment is when Moriarty shoots himself in the head.
I was literally about to say,
like, I literally was like, what the f***? How's he going to get out of this, right? But I think that divorcing it from the context of the rest of the show really hurt this on rewatch. Like, it didn't have the impact for me that I think it would have had if I had watched like all of season 2 or, Moriarty's first appearance at the end of season 1 all the way through to here. Like, just picking it back up at the end, I felt like I was jumping into a movie that was already 2/3 of the way over when this episode started.
I'm actually with you on that. I think that coming into this, my wife and I watched the very first episode a few days before, because we had been talking about rewatching the whole series anyways. So we watched the first episode, and then a few days later, I watched this episode. So I was able to appreciate a little bit more to see where they started in episode 1 and where they are here, in the 6th quote unquote episode. I think that when it comes down to it, this episode was just one of the most mind-bogglingly cool things I had ever seen when it came out.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, when I watched it, I should say. It puts this super smart protagonist in a place where you don't think that they can win.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what, I don't know. I mean, that's like, why is the Battle of Helm's Deep so cool? Because there's no way the heroes can win. Like, they're fighting an overwhelming force. It'll literally take the Holy Ghost to come in and win this battle for them, which he does.
Which it does, yeah.
Which it does. But you know what I mean? Like, I think that's what really hooks me about this episode is exactly that moment when Moriarty, you see the light bulb go off, and he goes, oh, the next chess move is to sacrifice the king.
Mm-hmm.
Like, It doesn't make any sense. He won't be able to see Sherlock fall, but he recognizes in order to make Sherlock fall, I have to die.
Yeah.
And it puts Sherlock in this literally unwinnable situation. It's the Kobayashi Maru, right?
Yeah.
He literally cannot win, but because he's freaking Sherlock, he already foresaw this and planned to fake his own death.
So, let's get into that, because I was going to say, like, and yet, given all of that, given how brilliant this episode is, I almost think this is an episode of TV that is ultimately too good for its own good. And here's what I mean by that. Like, the moments in Breaking Bad that I'm referring to, the moments in The Sopranos that I'm referring to are like really huge payoffs or like cliffhangers or whatever, that when they came back the next week and resolved that hanging thread, it was still coherent, it was still cohesive, everything still hung together. I think what happens at the end of this episode of Sherlock, the writers did what they needed to do. Like, they built through season 2 to this unwinnable conclusion that was like, this is what this show needs. And they served the show by doing what they did, by killing Moriarty, by making it appear that Sherlock jumped to his death. And then with that like weird ending where, oh, he's really not dead. How the hell did he get out of that one? And I almost wish, and I hate to say this, I almost wish that the show had just ended there, Brad. I almost wish that they left all of it to our imaginations of like, how the hell did Sherlock get out of that? How did he fake it? Because when they come back for season 3 and they finally have to start revealing how he faked his death, they make it a thing throughout season 3. People keep asking him, like, how'd you do it? How'd you do it? And they kind of give hints and, you know, maybe this and that. And ultimately, I found the whole rest of the series after this unsatisfying. Season 3 was still good. I didn't think season 4 was very good at all. But they could just never get back to the heights that they hit here. And it's because they kind of wrote themselves into a corner. Like, Moriarty's gone. Moriarty is dead. And like, they keep having to resurrect him throughout season 3 as this like specter that's haunting Sherlock. But for me, this is such a good episode and it hits such an oh shit moment that the series never really found a way to recover from it.
Well, and that's the problem with TV shows that genuinely are following a story arc, is that they hit the end of the first big, huge story arc and none of the rest will ever compare. You know, I think about a television show like White Collar. The first 2 seasons of White Collar are just so good, just amazing. And once they hit the end of that first big mystery storyline, it just never quite catches its wind again. Mm-hmm. And I'm with you, dude. I think Sherlock is the same way. The problem is Sherlock was building as a story towards this confrontation with Moriarty. But it was also episodic. He dealt with individual mysteries in each one. The Hounds of Baskerville, the Blind Banker, all these things. And seasons 3 and season 4 continue with the episodic nature of like, and he solves this crime and that crime. But the underlying story beneath it could never be as cool or as climactic as what happened with Moriarty. Mm-hmm. I will say, I wish that they had ended this episode without showing Sherlock alive. Because I think that builds, because they took so much time in between season 2 and season 3. it would have, I think it would have been so cool culturally to be like, is Sherlock dead? Is he alive? Like, it's like the top at the end of Inception. Did it fall? Did it stay up? Like, if they had not shown Sherlock alive, I think that the few years in between season 2 and season 3 would have been bonkers, because people would have been, rumors about, oh, are they filming another season, or are they coming back? Are they not doing it? Was that truly the end of the show?
Yeah.
I think that would have been so cool.
So what I thought was going to happen, like, if you remember the scene at the graveyard where, John is talking to the gravestone and they keep showing his reflection in that like black marble gravestone. And I'm like, oh, they're going to keep coming back to this shot, because it doesn't make sense to show that shot as much as they did. And I'm thinking like there's going to be a payoff. And what I was thinking would happen is like, John walks away, and then you see Sherlock's silhouette come and visit his own grave.
Yeah, dude, I literally thought the same thing.
And I kind of wish they had done that. And because if you do it in a way that's like, who is that? Who's that figure? Is it Sherlock? Is it Moriarty? Like, who's this figure hovering over the grave?
Is it Mycroft?
Right. And then you just cut to black from that. Then it introduces this element of like, who's watching over Sherlock's grave? Is he really dead? And I think to pan across that cemetery and just show Sherlock's face is like, oh, well, I felt a little bit like the end of How I Met Your Mother, where it's like, oh, you got me really emotionally invested in this, and now you're just going to pull the rug out from under me and tell me like, no, none of that mattered. This other thing is what this was all about the whole time.
I mean, honestly, it would be like, we've talked about Marvel enough. It'd be like eventually when they bring him back, but it'd be like at the end of Endgame if, you see Robert Downey Jr. just kind of hanging out off to the side, be like, man, look at all these people crying at my funeral.
Right.
That's pretty cool.
Right. All right, man, I think that's a good place for us to segue into final scores. I kind of want to hear what you think first, if that's okay with you, because I'm still struggling to understand how I'm going to score this. Am I scoring it as one episode? Am I scoring it as like a whole TV show? Am I scoring it as if it was a movie, or as if it is a TV show? Like, where are you falling on this, Brad?
Ah, man, that honestly, ever since I picked this to be on this season, I've really been struggling with how to score it. I will say this. I think as a television episode, I think it's a 10 out of 10. I don't know if you can hit the heights that this episode does. Honestly, the only thing that would keep me from maybe giving it a 10 out of 10 would be the fact that they show Sherlock at the end. I just think it'd be so much more impactful if you didn't know if he lived or died truly.
Can I ask you a question as you go into this? Like, how much does rewatchability factor into a 10 out of 10 score? Because like, as I was watching this, I think I realized this is the episode that hits you the hardest on first watch, but it's kind of like, like an M. Night Shyamalan movie in some ways, where like, once you know the twist, is it as good on rewatch anymore? And I think with Shyamalan, some of those movies are a yes and some of them are no. But like, I think that there are actually much better structured episodes of Sherlock than this one. And it's kind of like, does knowing the end take away from the rewatchability of this episode?
Yeah, I think it does.
All right.
Like just putting it simply, as I was watching this, I was like, man, it doesn't hit the same way it does as it did the first time. And that doesn't bother me.
Okay.
Like for me, the experience I had the first time of watching that episode was more than enough. That I would still give it a 10 out of 10 for an episode. I think that for this podcast, I think I'll give it a 9 out of 10. Because I think it's okay that we rate this compared to what we normally watch, which are movies. And in the pantheon of things we have watched for the Film and Whiskey podcast, actually, I just realized this is our first regular episode. We've done an episode on television before. We did The Grinch and
oh, that's
Brown.
true. Yeah, for a bonus episode. We did.
For a bonus episode.
Yep.
That's crazy.
Wow.
So, man, sorry about that. That was just popped into my head. So for comparing this to all the things we have watched on this show, I still think it's a really well-made piece of art. I think that it has phenomenal acting. The cinematography is great. It is a gripping, thrilling drama that keeps you at the edge of your seat, but it's no Vertigo. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like there is a difference between this and movies, and it may not be fair to compare it, but this is the Film and Whiskey podcast, and we do whatever the heck we want. I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10.
You know what? I'll do the same. I'll give it a 9. It isn't a movie. However you want to define what is and isn't a movie for yourself, that's something we can litigate later on. But for me, this is not like a low budget TV show, but TV is just shot differently than movies are. And there is something about that idea of what you refer to, like with Patrick Willems talking about what is cinematic. If they took this episode of television and they released it in theaters and you went to the movie theater and watched it exactly how it's shot, you would notice like there's, some of it just doesn't feel edited correctly for cinema. And some of the shot compositions are not designed for a big cinematic screen. And like, it's all fine because this isn't cinema. This is TV. And I'm totally okay with that. But when you start to try to evaluate it on the basis of a movie, I think that's where things start to get a little muddy. So I'm going to stick with you, Brad. I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. It's a great episode of television. But I think even if it's hard for us to define why, this really did kind of solidify for me that there is a difference between movies and TV, even TV that's made like movies.
Well, I am glad to have taken you down this exercise in thought, Bob.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yes. Yeah, Bob, honestly, I'm in the same place as you. This really just solidified for me that there is a difference between television and movies. If I'm being honest, Sherlock is the only show I've ever watched that really challenged that notion for me. But even now, I when I come down to it, this is one of the best television series ever made, and it still just isn't a movie. And I think that television can do things that movies can't. I think that you can't spend 200 hours with a character in a movie. Like the most you'll ever get on a really high budget, well done basis is probably the Harry Potter series. And even in that, you have 8 movies for a total of, 20 hours maybe to spend with Harry, Ron, and Hermione. So television can definitely help you fall in love with characters simply because you've spent hundreds of hours with them. But there is something that movies can do that dazzle the mind in a way that television shows can't. And so I'm okay with that. I'm pumped that we went through this. And guys, we want to discuss this with you. If you want to jump on, check out our Instagram, our Facebook, our Twitter. We would love to talk to you guys about this. Our handle is @FilmWhiskey, or get into our Discord. Bob and I record all of our episodes using Discord to talk to each other. We spend time discussing movies and whiskey and trucking and food and sports and all sorts of fun stuff on our Discord. There's a link to it at the end of every one of our show notes, so come check it out. My last plug is for Patreon. If you love what we're doing here, check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/filmwhiskey.
All right, Brad, all of my 10 remaining films from season 5 have been put into the randomizer wheel. I'm going to spin it here in just a second, but as always...
Dude, I can't believe that we're already 10... Is that 10 movies in? If you've done 5 and I've...
Yeah, we're more than 10 movies in here, because you've done more than me, and we had the Harry Potter at the beginning of the season. So we're almost halfway through season 5 already.
I can't believe that, dude. That's crazy.
All right. I need you to make some clickety-clack sounds for me as I spin this wheel.
Clickety-clacky-clack, clickety-clickety-clicky-clack.
Oh,
You're
next
welcome.
week, Brad, we are going to be watching the 1996 Disney animated classic, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. This was the movie that I subbed in place of the movie Out of the Furnace a few weeks back. Brad, I know you've never seen this, or that if you have, it's been a long time. I am telling you, dude, as a grown-up, this movie slaps. I cannot freaking wait to watch this movie with you.
Dude, I've honestly... I may have seen parts of it as a child because I grew up in the 90s. I don't think I've ever watched this movie fully through.
Oh, I can't wait, man. All right, so join us next week for The Hunchback. Until then, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.